Hi, I'm Anumita. I'm at the TCS Innovation Forum 2017 at IET Savoy Place. Join us for a session with Dr. Gabrielle Walker on the new climate of energy, policies, technology and culture.
A few weeks ago, I was moderating a panel in Brussels with the European Commission around digitalisation of a different sector. It was digitalisation and shipping. Now, I was quite surprised when I got that call. I didn't really expect that at all. And what they said to me is, we don't want to be seen anymore as being the old, cold industry. We want to be looking forwards. And you know, when even shipping are looking at this and seeing the relevance to them, then you know that this is something that's going everywhere. A wise man once said to me, an important message is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So you guys are already well at the table, you're not on the menu. Thinking about this is so important, and I think particularly for utilities. And I think we have quite a lot of telecoms here as well, frontline industries for this whole area, and also frontline industries for the area that I'm going to talk a bit more about, which is this new climate for energy. Now, I'm not going to say a lot more about digitalisation or the digital area at the moment, although we will come into it in the panel later on. What I do want to do, as we just heard, is to have a look at some of the bigger picture macro emerging trends that are so relevant both to this sector and to this topic. And the three specific ones that I want to look at are policy, technology and culture. And then, of course, in the title, A New Climate for Energy, there is a bit of a pun there, because what I'm going to talk about is the climate change context and how that affects all of those. So the first one, and probably the one that I'd like to spend a little bit more time on, is the policy area. Because, you know, I've been working in energy and climate change for 20 years now, and I've never known a time that's more dynamic, more changing, more creative and inventive, and also more alarming than this one for the developments in policy in climate change. And of course, the defining aspect of that was COP21 in Paris last year. So what happened at COP21 was rather extraordinary. More than 190 different countries and territories all agreed unanimously on a climate target for the world, 2 degrees. You all know that. Or in fact, well below 2 degrees if possible. The thing that I find extraordinary about that is it was more than 190 people agreeing unanimously about anything. It was actually impossible. I mean, imagine getting 190 people together who are your friends and trying to decide where to go for dinner. And then imagine trying to agree on more than 30 pages of densely argued legal text unanimously. And the question is, how did they do it? It was impossible. It can't be done. It was tried in Copenhagen several years earlier to absolute disastrous effect. And I think there's actually a couple of things that made it possible. And one of them was extraordinary diplomacy on the part of the French government. They were really brilliant at it. They did it as the French do best. They made sure everyone was fed. They made sure there were nice environments. And whenever there were difficulties in some of the negotiations, they actually had a team that they sent in. Do you know what the team that went in, the French team? They were called the Musketeers. They sent in the Musketeers to help. But actually, the biggest reason, I think, that the Paris Agreement happened was an extraordinary new groundswell of pressure and attention from the private sector. I would argue that business is the thing that made the difference. And not just business, but other non-state actors too, cities and states and regions and so on. It was extraordinary. Halfway through the Paris 2 weeks, there was one special day of action where all the non-state actors were there. And Christiana Figueres, who was then heading up the UNFCCC, was reading page after page after page of the initiatives that were coming out of the private sector. It was massive. And also this message from new players. You were getting a message from, you're getting a message from Pope Francis. You're getting the message from military generals. But you were also getting the message from Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England. You were getting the message from business CEOs going up on the stage again saying, this matters to me and my business, this matters to me and my sector. So I'm going to come back to that and the role of business, but I just wanted to raise it as an initial point. Okay, so next point is, what's the status now? Because things have changed in the last 2 years, particularly geopolitically. And we have a new president, you've probably noticed, in the United States, who doesn't have quite the same attitude to dealing with climate change that the previous president has, or indeed any president before has. And so the question is the Paris Agreement even relevant? And what about those initiatives that the businesses were bringing along? I would say that actually I'm quite surprised how apparently irrelevant Donald Trump's pronouncements on climate seem to be turning out to be. And I'll come back to why in a moment. I was looking up the other day a particular letter that was sent to Donald Trump in March 2017 saying, advising him against pulling out of the Paris Agreement, saying the Paris Agreement is an effective framework for addressing the risks of climate change. Any guesses as to who that letter came from? It doesn't have to, you don't have to give me the name. Maybe the organisation. What organisation wrote to Donald Trump saying that the Paris Agreement was an effective framework for addressing the risks of climate change? ExxonMobil. Very good. It was ExxonMobil. And that's partly what I'm going to come back to again, because there's been a slew of announcements you know about, and this is now getting a bit more relevant specifically to the utilities sector and to the conversation we're going to have about convergence later. But, you know, Apple is proudly announcing that it's powering 100% of its data centers with renewable energy and has been partnering up with, and in some cases creating new solar energy companies, saying, if it's not out there, we'll make it. Microsoft's doing the same thing now. Google's doing the same thing now. We're getting this convergence driven by this need for taking a leadership role. You know, in the US at the moment, companies like Mars and Staples and The Gap are writing to President Trump saying, oh, we continue to support the EPA's Clean Power Plan and the reduction of carbon emissions. We're disappointed the administration has decided to roll back climate regulations. Now, I have never, in all the time I've been working on this, heard companies saying again and again, we're disappointed that the government has decided to roll back more or less any regulations, and let alone climate regulations. So this really does feel different. And then even the US Secretary of Defense is saying climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where our troops are operating today. So we are seeing some changes within the US, but within the world of business, I'm feeling a new kind of leadership, a new kind of momentum, and a groundswell for change. So yesterday, for example, just yesterday, there was a letter released that was signed by 218 institutional investors. Between them, they've got more than $15 trillion in assets. And the letter said, we call on global leaders, it was addressed to the G20, we call on global leaders to continue to support and implement the Paris Agreement, to drive investment in the low-carbon transition, and implement climate-related financial reporting frameworks. So, you know, it used to be that if you looked very hard, you might be able to find one or two companies or one or two CEOs that were saying this. But now it's really widespread. And that last point, I think, is important because it's not just in all of the other sectors that might have been more traditionally worried about what their customers are thinking about them and wanting to protect their reputation. This is now moving into the realm of the financial sector, investments, and as a financial stability concern. And so this sort of started when Mark Carney was talking to a bunch of insurers about 18 months ago, he suddenly said, climate change is a risk to financial stability. And when he started saying that, he gave a whole bunch of reasons why he thought it was true. So that was in his capacity as the head of the Financial Stability Board, as well as governor of the Bank of England. But then after that, a whole lot of other things took place. In Paris, he announced that there was going to be the task force for climate-related reporting, which was headed up by Mike Bloomberg. Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever, said, finally, the financial sector are waking up to this. And then, really, I did not expect this quote to come from this person, but I won't make you guess, because you probably already know by now. In February last year, so just over a year ago, we got this, are you ready? Generating sustainable returns over time requires a sharper focus, not only on governance, but also on environmental and social factors facing companies today. For too long, companies have not considered these core to their business, even when the world's political leaders are increasingly focused on them, as demonstrated by the Paris Climate Accord. Over the long term, ESG issues have real and quantifiable financial impacts. Now that came from Larry Fink. That came from Larry Fink, who was the CEO of BlackRock. BlackRock in September last year then brought out a new report, Adapting Portfolios to Climate Change, Implications and Strategies for All Investors. And then in March this year, just 2 months ago, BlackRock put climate-related risk as one of their top engagement priorities for meetings this year with corporate leaders. Basically, all of their meetings with corporate leaders are going to say, what are you doing about climate risk in your organisation? And we will make our investment decisions on the basis of that. So it's not just BlackRock. Legal & General are doing this as well. Legal & General Investments, they're the UK's largest asset manager, more than $1 trillion assets under management. Last November, they launched a really interesting fund, Future World Fund. And that's, it tracks, it has a low tracking error, but that's specifically targeted to companies that are demonstrating that they're acting on climate change and this transition. I put them in here for 2 reasons. One is that one of the people running this fund said that she is now saying to every CEO that she's talking to, are you aware, and not just every CEO, but also the investors, are you aware that if you do nothing, you're actively investing in a 4-degree world? There's no option now for just no change. If you do nothing, you're actively investing in a 4-degree world. And in April, Legal & General wrote to 84 global companies saying they would vote against board chairmen at companies that they consider were not adequately preparing for the low-carbon economy. So this is really different. Then, UBS, not traditionally tree huggers, now have their Life Climate Aware World Equity Fund. It's tilted towards companies that are contributing positively, they think, to climate transition. And then there's the task force, Mike Bloomberg's task force, which has been reporting. It announced its results in December. And now in June, after a consultation, they're going to come out with, this is our recommendation. Every company should be doing this. This is how you report your climate risks. I've laboured that point a little bit because I suspect that the digital question, the digital transition, and also new technologies featuring very heavily at this meeting. And I just wanted to really make the point that they are taking place in the context of an extraordinary new climate, an extraordinary transition, and one that I think has such momentum and such leadership from the business sector, and increasingly from the investment and finance sector, that I think the momentum has now become unstoppable in that. Now, if you add that together with the technological developments, that's the second part of it. It was policy, technology, and culture. You don't need me to tell you that energy technology has been changing and that costs have been plummeting in lots of areas. You don't need me to tell you about the penetration, either exciting or alarming, or both, depending on where you come from, of things like solar PV, wind, potential for electric vehicles. I think also demand management, flexibility, smart grids, all of that, and the implications for the change in this particular industry. I wanted to mention 2 particular things in this area that relate to the rate at which this technology might be taken up. So there's a whole lot of scenarios that have been talking about the pace of which, for example, electric vehicles might come in, the pace of solar power. And if you look at the energy scenarios, your BP, your IEA, all of those, actually only one of them came close. All of them underestimated the extent to which solar PV would come into the picture over the last sort of five years or so. Only one of the scenarios, of all the hundreds of them, only one of them got close. Any guesses as to who that was? Who got the closest to predicting accurately the pace that solar PV would come in? Go on, give us a guess. It was Greenpeace. It was Greenpeace. And it was a scenario that led to 0 fossil fuels in the mix by 2050. Now, I do want to emphasize, scenarios are never predictions. They are never predictions. I think every scenario should have a big sign at the bottom saying, this is not a prediction, this is not a prediction, saying it twice to make sure you get the message. But nonetheless, it is kind of informative that we stand up in these places and we say, of course, we all know that in 2040, the energy mix is going to be this. And it ain't necessarily so. There was a report by Carbon Tracker called Expect the Unexpected that was looking specifically at the penetration of solar PV and e-vehicles. And They were doing different plausible, implausible, stretch calculations, models for different areas of the world and so on. I don't really know how much I'd want to emphasize the particular conclusions they came, although they did come to the conclusion that 10% shifts in market share could happen within a decade, which seemed to me kind of drastic, but they have the model to back it up, but nonetheless, nobody knows. For me, the most important and interesting thing that I got out of them was the message, there is no business as usual. There is no business as usual. And I say that because until now, we've always been comparing. We've got business as usual, we've got all the other scenarios, and they said we are in a time of such extraordinary change and transition that it doesn't even make sense to think about business as usual anymore. We need to think agile, we need to think dynamism, we need to think change. And that's the mindset that we need to have in our heads. And that brings me to the third item, which is culture. So I think this is the area that gets most neglected for most of the people that I speak to, most of the different sectors. It's the one, we're all, I gladden my heart to see people like Turing and Faraday. I'm a techie at heart, and we're all tech and engineers, and yet, in fact, the cultural aspects of this story might turn out to be the ones that are most important and the ones that are most risky to neglect, or the ones that have the most important opportunities. And I hope we'll have a chance to talk a bit more about that at the panel. But I just wanted to highlight one or two aspects of that I think are particularly important today. One of them is trust, reputation. And I know we're going to talk about this in the panel, but this shift in just global opinion about more or less everything, and unease about globalization, loss of control, lack of trust in more or less any institutions and in whole sectors and in individual companies, that's really penetrating. And at the same time, that goes together with the new digital revolution, with social media, with the possibility that I have a voice, that I can connect to other people who think the same thing. So this lack of trust, I think, is hugely important. Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever, said to me, I have to make sure my company is seen to be doing things that add value to society, because if they can bring Egypt down in 8 days, they can bring Unilever down in 2. So that's a very different kind of scenario. You look at what happened with Volkswagen. You look at what's happening now with attempts to sue different companies. Did you know about climate change? Are you acting on this? Is the question that ExxonMobil and actually Shell are now facing. Okay, so I also noticed that on my way here, I was catching up on the news and saw that Theresa May had been writing in The Sun. Did you see what she'd written? Okay, so the latest thing is that she said that she wants to put a cap on standard variable tariffs. And what she wrote in The Sun, and I quote, was, "Like millions of working families, I am fed up with rip-off energy prices." So that's a message that is not just coming on social media, that's a message that's coming from our Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen. So there is a story here that is not being told. And it's not the right story, and it's not being told by the right people, it's not being told to the right people, and it's not being built by listening to the right people. And I think that's something that we should probably come back to later. Another aspect about culture is the difficulty, the challenge, and the possibility of how do you bring an entrepreneurial mindset, a dynamic, agile, changing mindset, into a big established company that has been successful on the basis of the way that it already functions. And that is really hard, and I think that is increasingly necessary. So I've talked to General Electric about this, GE, I've talked to a couple of oil and gas companies about this, they're trying to do it. I talked to a shipping company about this, they're trying to do it. How do you do it? People have tried different ways. One CEO said, well, first of all, I put all the kind of the techie guys in one room and I kept them separate. I kept them as a separate division and had everyone else separately. That didn't work. And then I brought them in and we tried to merge it all. That didn't work. Now I've separated them out again, but I'm trying to do it in a different way. And eventually, I'll figure out a way to make the cogs fit. But it is increasingly necessary to be able to handle both the benefits of the leverage of a big company and the smaller ones, and then the entrepreneurial mindset too. I noticed actually the final part of the story is the customer empowerment part, and I know again we're going to talk about this later in the panel. I want to finish by saying something about new kinds of partnership, because I do think that that's going to end up being quite an important part of this story. Connections with customers, connections with supply chain, connections with other people within the sector, connections across sectors are actually, I think, going to be an increasingly important part of the story, especially around the culture and trust situation. And I think this is happening to many other sectors too. Many businesses, many sectors are looking at how they can talk more and partner more with NGOs, with customer representatives, with civil society groups, with policy advisors, and make much more of a partnership and much less of a kind of defense position or lobbying. This change is happening very fast. This change is happening very fast. It is, I would argue, being driven in very large part by the increasing momentum on the climate agenda. I also think, as I think many people do here, agility is going to be really essential. Agility and the mindset that embraces change. And I have one final comment on that, which is I heard Tom Ridsell-Smith this morning, the Chief Digital Officer of Woodside. He was talking about bringing AI into Woodside and machine learning. And he said what they wanted to do was capture what they already know, all the connections they had, how they could really use AI then to develop the company, to develop the strategy. And he thought that the millennials would be the ones that would go for it. That's what you'd think, right? But he said something fascinating, I thought. He said the people who actually went for it were the baby boomers. Because this is an opportunity to give their learning, to mentor, to make sure that they were relevant, to have some way of passing on what they knew. And that's my final comment, that when we think about culture, it is not the case that if you are older, if you're more established, if you're a bigger company, that you cannot develop this agile culture. Exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. If you're ready for it, if you know it's important, if you know that agility matters, it's a much more interesting world to be in my point of view. Thanks very much.
Any questions, anybody? We still have some time to get it right now.
Thanks very much.